Hello, hello. I will give it just a second as we've got folks entering from the waiting room. Thank you so much for joining us for the next session of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. We're so excited to have you here. We know we're getting far in the day, but really excited for this conversation in particular. I know Rashida and David will bring the energy, so please meet them there. Just to level set a little bit, let you know where you're landing today. It is Tuesday at 1:45 p.m., and we are in today's session From Complaint to Change, the case for reporting housing discrimination. And the session is sponsored by CHR. So thank you so much for your support for the conference and the session overall. Really excited to dive into today's conversation. Just a broad thank you to our sponsors at large. And without any further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Rashida to get us started today.
Thank you so much for that, Danielle. Hey, everyone. So glad that you guys can join us today. Let me get my slides set up so that you guys are able to see what we got going on here. Welcome. If you'd like, you could just drop, your name, where you're hailing in from in your chat box. My name is Rashida Rattray Reed. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And I'm just trying to make sure that my slides are showing properly. And I'm joined today by my colleague, David Lavery. He is the Director of Operations over at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And today we really want to talk to you a little bit more about, our intake process, I'm hoping that this is showing up for you guys. Are you guys still able to see my slides?
Yep.
Okay. Today we really want to talk to you about, the fact that fair housing is not a suggestion. It is a right. And like any other fundamental rights that we have, it must be fought for, defended, and enforced. And too often, a lot of the time, when housing discrimination occurs, the victim feels very confused or they feel isolated. And it's usually because the violation is not recognized and it goes unreported and swept under the rug. So today our aim is really to just emphasize how important reporting housing discrimination really is, and how this act of reporting housing discrimination is really a profound act of resistance and a crucial first step in being able to advance racial and economic justice. So today we'll dive into the numbers a bit. We'll learn from local success stories that we've had. And we'll just discuss how we here at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center are leveraging history and data to be able to transform individual complaints into community-wide victories. It really just boils down to accountability at the end of the day. And, we want to make sure that we're equipping our participants today with the tools that they need by highlighting past victories in a way that helps us to continue to hold people who violate the Fair Housing Act accountable. So that being said, let's move on to this slide here. And I'm seeing that my slideshow is being a little bit finicky because you guys can see all my other slides and my notes. So let's see if I can remedy that. And David, I'll actually give you a moment to give a little bit of intro about yourself and kind of talk about why this presentation is so important today.
Thanks, Rashida, and thanks for that introduction. I also just wanted to echo for what Rashida said earlier, if you would be willing to drop your name and your organization or where you're hailing from in the chat, that's really helpful. It's nice to have a sense of people's backgrounds as we go through this so we can tailor what we say. Like Rashida said, my name is Dave. I've been a staff attorney at the Fair Housing Center since 2016. And I've been the director of operations since 2023. Just really grateful that Rashida has brought me along so I can kind of ride the great job she does on all these presentations. I look forward to working with her on this.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, now that we've got our slides aesthetically pleasing, let's jump in. So a little bit about the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. We are a statewide civil rights nonprofit that is guided by the mission to ensure that all people have equal access to housing opportunities that are free from housing discrimination. We focus on the intricate ways that different forms of oppression are connected and how these connections contribute to housing discrimination. So what that means is that we're not just looking at housing discrimination as a single silo issue, right? we're looking at all the multiple identities that an individual that is facing housing discrimination may have, right? Is this person, for example, an individual that has a disability? Is this a family with children? Is this person, of a specific religion, of a specific race? We're always looking at the whole person to kind of see how these different forms of oppression intersect and how they can contribute to the housing discrimination that individual is facing. Um, the work that we have done at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center has transformed and has changed as times have changed. We were founded in 1994, and I can guarantee you the discrimination that we were seeing in 1994 is not the exact same discrimination that we are seeing right now in 2025, right? So as things have changed, we have kept our ear to the ground through, coalition building, through networking, through being in community with organizations such as the organizations that you all are a part of, to be able to hear about the issues that are being faced and to be able to kind of try to get ahead of ways that we can address those issues. And the way that we facilitate our work is pretty simple. We've broken it down into these categories, but there's a lot of overlap. We do offer legal enforcement. So we do fair housing investigations. We do foreclosure prevention and unfair trade practices litigation. We also do a lot of community education and outreach. A lot of you on this call may know me, may have seen me at your local community event, or I may have even gotten the opportunity to train some of you on the fair housing laws, on specific laws that relate to things such as disability or things such as VAWA or domestic violence protections. And lastly, we do a lot of systemic advocacy, a lot of public policy advocacy, a lot of litigation that truly attacks the root of these systemic issues. So here's a little bit of a landscape. I love to give a little bit of a history lesson. I'm going to try to cut that short. Shameless plug, if you want a history lesson, I would love to sit with your organization and do a training that really talks about the roots of these systemic issues that we're seeing in housing today. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to highlight over some things. So in order to make sure that everyone has equal access to housing opportunities, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It was passed in April of 1968, which makes April Fair Housing Month. And it was passed 7 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. This act prohibits discrimination based on your membership in a protected class in all forms of housing transactions. So not just if you're a renter, right? Even if you're someone who's interested in buying property or accessing shelter, you do have protections under the Fair Housing Act. We can define a protected class as a group of people who share characteristics that are protected from discrimination. And don't worry, I'm never going to use a word without giving you, some context in the next couple of slides. So you'll see what the protected classes actually are. But I just want to give Connecticut a little pat on the back because we have some really good statewide protections. So much so that when I go to conferences and I meet with other fair housing advocates from across the country, I often hear that Connecticut is one of the model states when it comes to fair housing protection. So we have enacted additional statewide laws that really have taken into account vulnerable populations of our communities. And what these protected classes look like is federally, it is a violation of the Fair Housing Act to discriminate against anyone in any housing transaction based on their race, color, national origin, sex, disability, religion, or familial status, which is the presence of family within presence of children within a family. Connecticut has added ancestry, marital status, age, sexual orientation, lawful source of income, gender identity and expression, veteran status, and as recently as October 2022, we were able to add individual status as a victim of domestic violence to our state protected class list. So we have some pretty solid protected classes, not just across the United States, but specifically here in Connecticut. But despite having these protected classes, despite being what's seen as a model state, we are still one of the most segregated states in the country. Unfortunately, 67% of our population of color lives in 8% of Connecticut's towns. And people with disabilities and people who have housing vouchers experience this discrimination at higher rates than every other protected class. And it's always, a shocker to see the number, right? The 67% living in 8% of Connecticut's towns. But it becomes even more jarring when you see this representation on a map. So this is a segregation map of Connecticut. The information here was pulled from our most recent census. And as you can see, the teal or blue on this map is representative of our percent of non-white residents by census tract. Now, I'm not here today to tell you that fair housing is the end all be all and, better enforcement of the Fair Housing Act is going to fix all the issues, right? No, but it will aid in once people are, able to access housing, they're going to be able to do that free from being discriminated against, free from being steered, free from, being refused rentals or refused being able to buy a home, right? So fair housing, like I like to describe it, is a piece of the puzzle that gets this map to look a little bit more diverse by our next census. David, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add here before I jump into the next slide.
No, I guess just to clarify, if the census tract in this map is not highlighted, it means that there's um, less than 15% of the tract is non-white, and by non-white we mean non-white and not Hispanic or Latino. So just to clarify that, but
Thank you. And I'm actually going to kick it over to you to describe the numbers aspect of this.
yeah, we just wanted to give a quick snapshot of what like a year of complaints that we receive looks like. So we've got it broken out on the left, where we're about 40% fair housing complaints, 40% landlord-tenant complaints, and landlord-tenant complaints also often have fair housing or fair housing adjacent issues in them. And then we've got that last around 20% our foreclosure prevention work. And then on the main kind of pie chart, you can see, I know Rashida already touched upon this, but overwhelmingly we're dealing with people who are experiencing discrimination because they're using something like a Section 8 voucher or a RAT voucher or some other kind of housing assistance, or it's related to their disability. A substantial portion of disability issues involving like reasonable accommodations or reasonable modifications in housing. And I think the thing that I would just be remiss in not flagging is that the way we collect data doesn't really um, highlight the intersectionality of people who are experiencing discrimination um, who often may be of a different race or color or national origin and also be trying to use a voucher or trying to obtain an accommodation on account of their disability. Um, yeah, if you want to continue, Rashida, that'd be great.
So a big part of this too is, ensuring that people are able to identify what housing discrimination looks like in their housing search. We fear that maybe because people are unsure of whether the acts perpetrated are discrimination or are discriminatory, would be why there is some hesitancy in reporting housing discrimination. So today I'm here to kind of clear up some of that and hopefully give you some solid examples of what this housing discrimination looks like. So one is misrepresenting the availability of housing. This usually occurs when a housing provider falsely tells a prospective tenant or buyer that the property is not available when it actually is. For example, a landlord has a vacant apartment. A person of a certain national origin calls to inquire. The landlord tells them, I'm sorry, this unit was just rented, or we're currently fully occupied and have a very long wait list, but then immediately tells a different looking or different sounding caller that the apartment is available for viewing. Refusal to rent or sell, this is a direct denial of housing despite the applicant being otherwise qualified. For example, they're qualified in meeting the credit or income requirements. And a way that this shows up is like a well-qualified single mother with 2 minor children applies for an apartment. The landlord states, we don't rent to families with children, or this building is for adults only, citing an illegal preference against familial status. Unequal terms and conditions. This involves treating one applicant or tenant differently than others after they have expressed an interest or have been approved based on a protected class. So for example, a landlord charges a person with a disability a higher security deposit than other tenants, or changes a minority tenant's rent, making it higher for the exact same apartment, or even imposes stricter rules on a family with children than on tenants without children. We see uses of threats, intimidation, or coercion, which involve hostile actions, verbal abuse, or undue pressures to interfere with the person's enjoyment of their dwelling or force them out. So, for example, a property manager makes unwanted sexual advances towards a tenant, implying or explicitly stating that the tenant's refusal will lead to a rent increase or a termination of the lease. Discriminatory advertisement. This occurs when a public notice, sign, or ad expresses a preference or limitation for or against a protected class. So, for example, an online ad for an apartment states no Section 8, big, bold, red letters underlined, or any other government assistance, or, seeking quiet Christian renter, or must speak fluid English are some examples of terminology in ads that are discriminatory. And lastly, discrimination with a smile, which is often the most subtle and difficult to prove. It seems as if a housing provider is being friendly or, trying to help this person, but it's really a disguise for a discriminatory motive. So, for example, a real estate agent tells a client, I know you're interested in this area, but you might feel more comfortable in a neighborhood with more people that look like you. Or in an attempt to steer this person away from this unit, they'll say, hey, like, I don't have a hard time understanding you, but I feel like other people in this neighborhood would. You might be more comfortable living in neighborhood B as opposed to here, right? So those are some common examples of how housing discrimination can show up in a housing search. This is not at all like a definitive list, right? There could be more instances or more examples that could fit here, but this is kind of what we see more frequently in housing discrimination cases. So we want to talk a little bit about how do you actually report housing discrimination? What does this process look like? So first and very foremost, you're going to want to get your name, the address, the phone number of the individual or organization in which you're making this allegation against. Ideally, you would have a short description of the event that caused you to believe that you were being discriminated against. Be sure to include the date of the alleged violation. We also want any other evidence that you may have, such as text messages or emails, or a copy of a discriminatory ad. And ideally, you'll take that information, you'll call our intake line, or you will access our online portal. I always want to make it a point to highlight that if you feel like a discriminatory action has happened, please don't tell the person that, the alleged allegation is against, that you're going to report them, right? Because many of us know that if we're at home and we're going to have company and we're expecting company, we're going to clean up, right? If there is some discrimination happening, we want to be able to investigate it and see what's happening. We don't want something to happen that kind of changes the behavior of the person who is perpetrating that discrimination. So it's important that you don't tell them, hey, I'm going to report you. You collect as much evidence as you possibly can, and you bring all that evidence to us. David, I just wanted to give you a second to see if there's anything you wanted to add here.
Thanks, Rashida. I was going to circle back with what Rashida's saying here and what we conveyed on the last slide. So we had those 6 boxes on the last slide. 4 of those boxes, misrepresentation, refusal, unequal terms, and discrimination with a smile, they really require, in most cases, kind of what we call comparative evidence. And so without the ability to kind of investigate further, we may not be able to establish that discrimination occurred, even if we're pretty sure it did. And that's why kind of Rashida is saying, collect your records, but bring them to us first before you engage in conflict with the housing provider, because if there's some prior conflict, we may not be able to establish that comparator evidence of like, they misrepresented the unit being available to the Section 8 tenant, but we were able to find out that they would rent to somebody else, or, they told you that, go ahead and apply. Oh, you're not qualified, but then we kind of like are able to look at the qualifications and investigate further and find out that you probably would have been qualified. Um, You want to go back to your, yeah. Okay, great.
So what happens after reporting, right? Like you have your evidence, kind of what is the process? So number one, you're going to call our line. You're going to talk to an intake specialist. That intake specialist is going to take down the account of what that short description. They're going to take all of that information and whatever evidence that you may have, they're going to collect that also. They are gonna talk to an attorney. The attorney is gonna review the details that was presented to them from the intake specialist, and investigate to see if there's any fair housing laws that have been violated. And it could lead to representation or referral to other resources, right? If we do see that there is a law that was, if the fair housing law was violated, we can usually resolve these issues through advocacy, but sometimes it does require legal representation. And even if there are no fair housing laws that are violated, we might be able to refer you to other resources that would be able to help you if there are other laws that are violated with that behavior. David, tagging you in to see if you have anything else to add to this.
That's a great summary of our process. I guess we'll pause because I think there might be a question. Many undocumented renters feel they don't have this right and they fear filing complaints. Um, so for an undocumented renter, I mean, I could say that we're not collecting information about their status. We wouldn't necessarily record that, and we would treat that as privileged information anyway. And then we would talk through, right, the pros and cons of enforcement of a complaint, right? Because it's always the individual's choice about how they're going to proceed with things. We might give them what we think are options and options that we could help them with, options that somebody else might be able to help them with. Um, but right, like if you had a clear situation where you've got a housing provider potentially discriminating against people based on their national origin, then we would outline their options for them in a way that would protect their status.
Thank you for that. And this is really why reporting matters, right? Reporting matters because there could be some potential relief for that individual that has been discriminated against. That relief can look like securing a unit. It could look like financial compensation. It could even be policy changes around, how that landlord or how that housing provider goes forward with their process, right? It creates a record for the future. You're able to obtain policy changes because we're able to reference that discrimination that happened. And it could also help future victims, right? To be able to understand that this specific discriminatory behavior is a violation of their rights. It also fuels systemic change. We're able to have better policy, and to be able to fund more systemic litigation and have more funding for enforcement from, any reporting that is done of housing discrimination.
Sorry, Rashida. I'm gonna take responsibility for that typo and apologize to any Bettys in the audience also on that last page. I would like to blame my sick 5-year-old, but I think it was just me.
Sorry, Betty.
No.
And this is where we kick it over to you, Dave, to kind of walk us through some of these Connecticut specific cases and kind of what happened and what was the result and how did it help us to be able to do our work a little bit better.
Yeah, so what I wanted to do was kind of pick out a handful of Connecticut Fair Housing Act cases, both that involved the State Fair Housing Act and the Federal Fair Housing Act, that kind of, I hope, illustrate the breadth of the issues and the reach of the act, as well as are useful to the particular audience for this conference. Um, I did notice we had a bunch of, but we didn't get too many uh, people jump in the chat about where they're from, but I did notice we had a bunch from towns and cities. So I'm going to go out of order and start with the Cromwell case. The Gilead versus the town of Cromwell case was and I apologize, most of these cases are not mine. I'm sure the attorneys who handled them would do a better job of describing them than me. But Gilead versus Cromwell was a case where the uh, a nonprofit that was providing housing for adult men who are recovering from substance abuse. They operate houses for the men to live in the community. Um, they tried to operate in the town of Cromwell, which led to the town taking a number of actions to prevent them from operating. And the town also refused to grant an accommodation under the Fair Housing Act for them to operate. Um, the litigation and the town's acts and the litigation led to one of the largest Fair Housing Act verdicts in the U.S. and I think potentially the only one allowing punitive damages against a town. The verdict was ultimately reduced, but it ended up at 2 million in punitive damages. And all of these cases also include a sizable amount of attorney's fees for the prevailing parties, in this case, Gilead. The reason I flag this for the towns is that we've also looked at a number of other towns' zoning practices, and we found that most don't have any knowledge or procedure in place to review accommodation requests from an entity like Gilead. I want to say we looked at 18 or so, and only one of them um, knew what an accommodation would be and how to handle it. Um, so I'm flagging that for the folks from towns joining. And then the other case is kind of to show the reach, right? So we have had sorry, let me Gilead's from kind of resolved in 2024, so a very recent case. Vian's was an insurance case, so a the landlord had their property insurance non-renewed because the insurer decided they had too many Section 8 tenants. I don't know that that kind of discrimination is quite as widespread in the insurance market as it was. This was from 2015. I am fairly confident that it still happens in multifamily lending. And it's difficult for us to find out about this, right? Because the folks engaged in getting commercial property insurance or multifamily lending don't necessarily come to a place like the Connecticut Fair Housing Center when they have an issue. But they may be familiar to folks attending this particular conference. Um, the Hilton case was a case where um, the landlords in that case were actually black, and they had rented a unit to a mixed race couple. I want to say the husband was black and the wife was white. The couple they were renting to tried to move out and wanted to sublease the place to a new black tenant. And the landlords refused because they didn't want um, any more black tenants in their use in their unit, and that's what they said to their current tenants. It was kind of a particularly egregious case, but it was, I thought, notable for like the idea that like um, just because you might be a member of a protected class yourself doesn't mean you can't discriminate against somebody else. And I think to an extent, it's maybe relevant for some of our like nonprofit friends who provide housing, just to encourage you to review your kind of arrangements to ensure like you don't have quotas for certain groups and things like that that may run afoul of the Fair Housing Act. And then the last case I laid out here was our case against Liberty Bank from 2018, 2019, which was really a case that we wouldn't have been able to um, ever even kind of develop the understanding of the issues that were going on in the lending market if we weren't able to develop um, that comparative evidence that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, just kind of the time and space to look at how an entity is treating different groups of people. I think that's kind of all I wanted to mention was kind of just that breadth and scope of the Fair Housing Act and its protections.
So much for that. So we have a little bit of a call to action, right? We are asking of you guys that are here today to kind of lean in, right? So one of the things that we are asking for is, for service providers to continue to be hungry for knowledge, right? Reach out to us for trainings, be receptive when I reach out to you to build that connection for a training. Ideally, what we would like is for you to have a fair housing training on a yearly basis, right? Knowing that laws change, things change, especially in 2025, things have been changing super quick. So we just want to make sure that you guys are all updated on the latest changes, if any, right? So every year you should be trying to schedule a fair housing training for yourself. Help your clients navigate this process of finding housing, being able to identify housing discrimination, and then being able to report that housing discrimination to us, right? Make us aware also of any patterns that you're seeing with your clients. For example, if you're someone who is a service provider for tenants that have disabilities, and you're noticing that a lot of your clients are having hard times getting their reasonable accommodations or reasonable modification requests acknowledged or fulfilled, please reach out to us and give us that information and let us, let us know. Um, for our municipalities, if we have any municipal officials here in our chat, we just want to make sure that you're continuing to ensure that there are policies in place for people who have disabilities. I'm going to actually have Dave jump in and give us a little bit more detail on the zoning and permitting and training social service staff.
Yeah, so when we think, I think the Fair Housing Act and what municipalities do doesn't have a ton of overlap, but the areas that it does, we talked a little bit about where it might overlap with zoning. There's like the Gilead case, there's what we call sober houses for adults. There's also, group homes for adults with disabilities. And then there can be smaller items like folks wanting to um, have alternatives to where their driveway or ramp is placed so they can access their housing. Um, there also is, I want to say, some programs that may overlap with the Fair Housing Act, like towns that have, and now I'm getting out of my expertise area, but towns that have Uniform Relocation Assistance Act requirements may have to grant accommodations for people who are using those benefits. And then I think my understanding is a lot of towns have social services staff who may interact with people seeking help and helping them navigate kind of their rights. Well, there may be a substantial amount of overlap with the Fair Housing Act there.
Awesome. And yes, for municipalities, we are urging you to train social service staff just as often, right? Every year, try to schedule a training with us to keep yourselves abreast of any changes that could have arisen. And lastly, yeah, with our legislators, try to maintain a dialogue about gaps in the fair housing law with the center. I see that we have a question in the chat box. But Dave, I don't know if you wanted to expand on that legislator portion again, just a little bit.
Yeah, so before we turn to the question, you know, I with the Connecticut, like Rashida mentioned at the beginning, Connecticut's been great about adding protected classes as kind of our understanding of who should be protected by the law has evolved. I would say there's also some from time to time there's some gaps. One that has jumped out at me for a long time is that there's a federal law called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act that has somewhat similar source of income protections to this to Connecticut's Fair Housing Act. But in the federal law, they've protected other lawful sources of income, like pensions. And I found it interesting that in the Connecticut law, we call the protection for lawful source of income, but we have only kind of protected things like Social Security, voucher assistance, child support, but we haven't kind of protected the full breadth of lawful source of income. I mean, to an extent, it could be moot, right? Like a pension is often going to be associated with age as well, so the state act might end up protecting those folks based on age, but not always. So that's what we would encourage for legislators. Okay, so for some questions. Would municipal policies concerning the development of supportive housing units be covered under the Fair Housing Act? Um, that would be tough to answer. Like generally, the idea that without more specifics, I would say, kind of where the question is coming from, because there's a lot of directions it could go. Um, I mean, I don't know of any in Connecticut, but I know in other areas there's been Fair Housing Act litigation over the placement of housing, like municipal placement of housing. Um, right, like if it's placed in or overly concentrated in segregated communities, it might raise Fair Housing Act concerns. Um, so that would be my kind of, yeah. Is it potential that maybe the placement of supportive housing units um, might be subject to some kind of review under the Fair Housing Act? There's also kind of design and construction standards, but I would expect that to mostly be kind of municipalities be aware of those issues. Feel free to add in the chat a more specific question if you have one. And then another question was, would the Fair Housing Center develop a fair housing policy for municipalities? We've worked in cases that have been in litigation with the defendants over what their policies should look like. In in a case that was brought by us and the Department of Justice against the town of Walcott, we developed like an accommodation policy for the zoning office. Um, whether I mean it's whether we can develop the policies for the towns like outside of that scope is a bit more challenging because we don't necessarily want to be in a situation where we're um, unable to provide services to people because we've engaged in substantial work for the town or municipality. But we can often um, connect towns with resources for that if we can't do it ourselves.
Yeah, and I think the fair housing trainings too kind of give our municipalities a very solid baseline of where they can go and what direction they should be going when they're considering developing policy, right? I know there's a lot more layers to that. But the training is really a good place to start to kind of understand what is the baseline, what is the law essentially saying, and how to not be in violation of that. There was a clarification that came in for that question, Dave, and it did say before it gets to litigation. So does that change your answer a little bit or?
No, that's what I was trying to capture when I said like it's difficult if it's not been in litigation because we may not be able to kind of limit our ability to represent potentially impacted folks from the town or city. Um,
So this actually brings us to the end of our presentation. We are super early, so we would love some discussion, or I'm just going to start asking questions of my own and have a conversation with Dave here. But honestly, we would love to hear your feedback on this training, on this process. So there's a training feedback survey link here that you could scan with your phones. Um, we have our website listed here. A ton of great resources. If you are curious about the work that we're doing, please feel free to go to our website and sign up for our newsletter. We also have our intake lines listed here. Our main intake line is English and Spanish, but we also have a toll-free line where there are other translators that are available. And lastly, if you're more comfortable, you can report housing discrimination online by visiting our portal on our website. So I'm going to leave this slide up for a little bit. I see that we have another question that popped into the chat. Are there any types of housing that is not covered under the state or federal Fair Housing Act? David, I shoot that over to you.
um, Rashida knows the answer to this question. I think it's easiest probably to think like that unless it's a two family owner occupied unit, it's probably going to be covered. That might be the easiest way to remember it. It's obviously not an exhaustive answer, but uh,
Yes. So if it's not two family owner occupied, it's probably covered. Is there any other specificities that you wanted to add to that question? What about a landlord stating that their property is not Section 8 qualified? I have an answer to this question, but I'm always going to defer to Dave first.
No, Rashida, you take this one first.
My view is that it should be. So my thoughts is that the landlord would need to get their property Section 8 qualified. I think this is a question about the what is detailed as the rigorous process for inspections for a Section 8 property. And to that question, I say that the what is being asked of for, a Section 8 property is usually in line of what is going to make any person that is living in that unit comfortable, and happy and being able to live in that unit. So my answer to that question is if they say that it's not qualified, my next statement is to, well, we should work on getting it to be able to be qualified. Dave, feel free to tell me that I'm wrong.
No, Rashida, Rashida is right. If it that I would consider stating a property is not Section 8 qualified to likely be a discriminatory statements violation on its face in most situations. Um, the only example I have ever kind of felt comfortable stating that might apply to is when I used to live in Brooklyn, New York, there was a lot of railroad style apartments where there would be four rooms and only the front and kitchen would have windows. And so they would often be rented as two bedrooms, but I do believe that those would actually not count as a two bedroom for a Section 8 program, but that's a very specific and narrow situation where you don't like have the right amount of windows, which is not going to be super common to my knowledge around here.
All right, so I'm looking in the chat box. I haven't seen anything yet. Once again, I'm going to give a plug for some of our trainings that we offer. We do fair housing overviews that talks about the fair housing law in more of a general perspective. If you would like a more focused fair housing training as it applies to individuals with disabilities or source of income, that is also an option that can be provided to you or your organization. We also do quite a few other presentations, one being 100 Years of Fair Housing History, where we delve into the last 100 years and kind of the policies that were put into place and how those have, formed our built environment and contribute to the segregation that we're still seeing here in Connecticut and nationwide. But that presentation is definitely more Connecticut focused. And another presentation that we are currently building out, which is entitled Unsung Heroines, that speaks about women of color in the civil rights and fair housing spaces, kind of how they've contributed to those movements. So those are some of the trainings that we offer. In this training feedback survey, you'll be able to see a list of potential trainings and see which ones spark your interest. We're excited to hear from you. We want to know what you want to see from us so that we can meet you where you are. I see another question. Do you report a landlord who is determined not to rent to Section 8 tenants because of their bad experiences with past renters? David?
It sounds like it's discrimination to me against Section 8 voucher
That's what it
holders.
sounds like. It
So,
sounds like it's discrimination against source of income. And I think you should definitely refer any clients that you are seeing that are, trying to access that housing and getting denied. If it's possible that they could get denials in writing, that would be super helpful. But I think it's something that should be reported. Yes. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions. I do want to give you guys the chance to type if you are typing. So I just want to take this moment to thank the partnership for this amazing conference. Thank you for allowing us to have this opportunity to present about the work that we do and to hopefully encourage all of our participants today to be able to identify that housing discrimination and report it, because reporting is so integral to the work that we do. We need for you to tell us what you're seeing on the ground. We need for you to report that housing discrimination to us. So thank you guys so much for allowing us into your space. Thank you for engaging with us. And with that being said, and no other questions in the chat box, I am happy to give you guys back 15 minutes to prepare for your next session.
It's just going to say that gives people plenty of time to go use the bathroom, grab some water, gear up for the next conversation we've got on the docket. We've got 3 more sessions left before we wrap up the day, and maybe some of you will see us at the Lyceum for our reception tonight. If not, we're grateful to have you here with us. If folks do want to come off mute, I think you do have the ability to unmute yourself, so if it's easier for you to participate in the conversation that way, just wanted to name that. We'll give it a minute, and then I'll hold Rashida's suggestion to wrap up a little early. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate all the work you do at the Fair Housing Center. We wouldn't be able to do all of the wonderful things we do without all of the wonderful things you are doing. So it's a collaborative effort, and just grateful for all the work you do.
Thank you so much.
All right. I'm not seeing any questions come through, so we will let you all leave. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
We'll see you later, everyone. Bye, y'all.